Millionaire buys an abandoned amusement park with several children without their parents. He is shocked to discover that they all ran away from their parents. Richard Thompson stared at the immense rusted gate before him, his hands firmly gripping the newly acquired deed to Joyland Park. At 45 years old, this successful businessman had already transformed various failed ventures into veritable commercial empires, but something about this place intrigued him differently. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned structures. The park's old sign, once colorful and vibrant, was now faded and partially covered by vines. Richard adjusted his impeccable suit and pushed the gate, which yielded with a prolonged creak. His footsteps echoed on the cracked concrete as he advanced, observing the remnants of what was once a place of joy and fun. The Ferris wheel, imposing even in its state of abandonment, rose against the orange sky. The carousel horses, once bright and majestic, were now covered by a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. "This place has potential," he muttered to himself, already visualizing the possibilities for renovation and modernization. His assistant, Charlie, had questioned the purchase. After all, amusement parks were outside his usual investment portfolio. But Richard felt something special here, a unique opportunity that went beyond the numbers in his cost spreadsheet. As he walked among the old attractions, a gentle breeze blew, making the metal structures groan. It was then that something caught his attention. A small teddy bear, surprisingly clean for a place abandoned for so long, resting near the entrance to the House of Mirrors. Richard approached, intrigued. As he picked up the toy, he noticed it was only slightly dusty, as if it had been left there recently. His experienced businessman's instinct alerted him that something wasn't as expected. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his strong voice echoing among the empty structures. Only the wind responded, gently swaying the chains of the nearby swings. He decided to investigate further. As he approached the House of Mirrors, he noticed small footprints in the dust, children's footprints. His heart quickened slightly. The park had been closed for over a decade, according to the records he had studied before the purchase. There shouldn't be recent signs of human presence. That's when he heard it. A child's laugh, distant and almost inaudible, coming from the direction of the old puppet theater. Richard turned quickly but saw no one. The shadows of late afternoon were beginning to lengthen, giving mysterious shapes to the abandoned structures. "Hello?" he called again, walking towards the theater. "You don't need to be afraid, I'm the new owner of the park." As he approached the theater, he noticed more signs of recent occupation. Small toys organized on an improvised shelf, some cookie wrappers, and what appeared to be a folded sleeping mat in the corner. Someone, or several people, was using that space as shelter. A sudden movement behind the dusty stage curtains caught his attention. Richard approached slowly, trying not to startle whoever was hiding. As he pulled back the heavy fabric, his eyes widened in surprise. A pair of childlike eyes stared at him from the darkness, reflecting the last ray of sunlight entering through the broken windows. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, extending his hand. "You can come out." The child retreated further into the shadows, and it was then that Richard realized it wasn't just one child. There were other pairs of eyes watching him from the darkness, silent and frightened. His brain began to rapidly process the situation. Children hiding in an abandoned amusement park, living in the shadows like little ghosts. The question hammering in his mind was, why were they there? And more importantly, who had left them in that place? Before he could ask any questions, a distant metallic sound caught his attention. The children reacted instantly, shrinking further into the shadows. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, whispered urgently, "He's coming back, you need to leave. Now." The girl's warning made Richard freeze. His instinct told him to run, but something stronger kept him there. Years of business experience had taught him to trust his intuition, and now it was screaming that these children needed help. "Who's coming back?" he asked in a low voice, moving closer to the group. The children looked at each other, clearly torn between fear and the need to trust someone. That's when one of them, a boy of about 12, stepped forward. His eyes showed a maturity beyond his years, as if he had been forced to grow up too quickly. "The man with the blue van," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He brings food and water, but we can't leave here. Ever." Richard felt his stomach turn. Before he could ask more questions, another child, smaller than the first, pulled on his sleeve. "Please, sir," she begged with teary eyes, "don't tell him you saw us. He gets angry when someone finds out." The businessman crouched down to be at eye level with the children. He quickly counted. There were 7 with apparent ages between 6 and 12 years old, all thin with worn clothes, but surprisingly clean for those living in an abandoned park. "How long have you been here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite his growing anxiety. "I don't really remember," replied the girl who had given the first warning, "but it was winter when I came. Now many summers have passed." The sound of an engine in the distance made the children stir again. The oldest of them, a girl with long dark hair, assumed a protective stance. "Go to the old office," she whispered quickly. "Behind the bookshelf there's a small door. Hide there. He always comes through the back gate and comes straight here." Richard hesitated for only a second before following the instruction. He quickly crossed the park, guided by the faint twilight light, until he found the administrative building. The door was unlocked, creaking softly when he pushed it. The office was a silent testimony to abandonment. Scattered papers, dust-covered furniture, old photographs of the park in its glory days. He found the bookshelf mentioned by the girl and, with some effort, discovered the small camouflage door. He had barely hidden when he heard heavy footsteps approaching the theater. Through a small crack, he could partially see the park's central courtyard. A tall, robust figure walked with determined steps, carrying some bags. "I brought food," announced a deep voice. "But first I need to know, did we have visitors today?" The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Richard held his breath, his heart beating so hard he feared it might be heard. "No, sir," one of the children answered, their voice trembling slightly. "Nobody came." "Are you sure?" The man's voice had a veiled, threatening tone. "Because I saw different marks on the ground, footprints I don't recognize. It must be because we played a lot today," the older boy quickly intervened. "We ran around the park a lot." Richard could feel the tension in the air even from his hiding place. The man remained silent for a few moments that seemed eternal. "You know what happens to liars, don't you?" he finally asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Remember what happened to Peter when he tried to escape?" The children murmured something in agreement, and Richard realized he was holding his breath. Who was Peter? What had happened to him? "Good," the man continued. "I'll leave the food. I'll be back tomorrow at the same time, and remember, this is our secret. Nobody can know you're here, it's for your own good." The heavy footsteps gradually moved away, and Richard waited until he heard the distant sound of an engine starting, before daring to move. When he finally came out of his hiding place, his mind was buzzing with questions and theories. In the dusty office, he began to rummage through the old drawers, looking for any clue about the park's history that might help understand this surreal situation. That's when he found, hidden under a pile of administrative documents, a yellowed newspaper page. The headline made his blood run cold. "Mystery. 7 children disappear from local orphanage." Richard held the newspaper clipping with trembling hands. The date stamped at the top of the page indicating that the report was from 10 years ago. His eyes quickly scanned the yellowed lines, absorbing every detail. 7 children had disappeared from St. Clair's orphanage, located less than 2 miles from the park. The coincidence was too disturbing to be ignored. With his heart racing, he continued searching through the files. Among administrative documents and old payroll sheets, he found something even more intriguing. A list of employees from the park's last year of operation. One name in particular caught his attention: Gabriel Sanders, maintenance supervisor. Next to the name there was a handwritten note: "Fired for suspicious behavior with underage visitors." The businessman carefully tucked the documents into his jacket. The sun had already set completely, and darkness was beginning to take over the park. Using his cell phone flashlight, he made his way back to the theater. The children were still there, now sharing the food that the mysterious man had left. "Did you come from St. Clair's orphanage?" he asked softly, showing the newspaper clipping. The older girl, who seemed to be the leader of the group, hesitated before answering. "Some of us." "Yes. I'm Anna. This is Luke." She pointed to the boy who had spoken before. "And that's Mia." She indicated the little girl who had given the first warning about the man's return. "Why didn't you run away? Why did you stay here all this time?" Anna lowered her eyes, nervously playing with the hem of her faded blouse. "At first we tried. Peter was the bravest of us. He said he was going to get help." Her voice faltered. "After he disappeared, we learned not to try anymore." Richard sat down on one of the old theater benches, trying to process all that information. "The man who was here, did he work at the park before?" Luke approached, his eyes revealing a mixture of fear and hope. "He says he did. He says nobody wants us out there, that only he cares about us, that if we tell anyone, we'll end up on the streets." "But now you're here," Mia completed, her small voice carrying a spark of hope. "You bought the park, didn't you? Can you help us?" The businessman observed those young faces, marked by years of isolation and fear. His negotiator's mind was already plotting strategies, but he knew he needed to act with extreme caution. One wrong move could put those children in even more danger. "We need to be very careful," he finally answered. "That man, does he always come at the same time?" Anna nodded. "Every day at dusk. On weekends, sometimes he comes earlier. He brings food, water, and some clothes when we need them." Richard took his cell phone out of his pocket, but there was no signal there. The park was in a remote area, surrounded by a small forest that isolated it even more. He realized he would need help, but also that he couldn't simply leave and abandon those children. "There's one more thing you need to see," said Luke, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy led Richard to the back of the theater, where a half-hidden door led to a basement. "This is where he keeps Peter's things and the others who tried to escape." The businessman felt a shiver run down his spine. Carefully, he descended the narrow steps, lighting the way with his cell phone. The basement was full of old park boxes, but in one corner there was something different. Dusty school backpacks, some clothes carefully folded, and photographs. Many photographs. Picking up one of the photos, Richard immediately recognized the smiling face of a child he had seen in the newspaper report. On the back, there was a date and a note. "First day. Always remember why we do this." "He keeps everything," whispered Anna, who had come down behind him. "He says it's to protect us, but..." A noise coming from the upper part of the theater made everyone freeze. Footsteps. Someone had returned. "He never comes back this early," Luke murmured, panic evident in his voice. Richard quickly turned off the flashlight, plunging everyone into the darkness of the basement. The footsteps were now approaching the door that led to them. The silence in the basement was so dense that Richard could hear the accelerated breathing of the children around him. Anna, with the experience of years living in that place, silently guided the group behind some old boxes. The footsteps above them continued, now accompanied by a second pair. "Are you sure you saw someone entering the park?" An unknown voice asked. "Absolutely. A car parked at the entrance this afternoon. We need to check." The second voice belonged to the man with the blue van. Richard felt Mia grab his hand, trembling. Through the cracks between the ceiling boards, they could see beams of flashlight light moving on the upper floor. His brain was working frantically, trying to find a way out. That's when he noticed something, an old maintenance passage, partially hidden behind a dusty shelf. "Anna," he whispered almost inaudibly, "where does that passage lead?" The girl squinted in the darkness. "To the House of Mirrors. It was used by employees during the shows." The footsteps were now approaching the stairs leading to the basement. Time was running out. With silent gestures, Richard directed the children to move towards the passage. Luke, who knew every inch of that place, went in front, guiding the eyes way. The passage was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl in some stretches. The air was heavy with decades of dust, and cobwebs brushed their faces. Behind them, they heard the basement door open. "Someone has been here recently," the voice of the man with the van echoed. "Look at the marks in the dust." The group continued advancing through the passage, each movement calculated not to make noise. Richard could feel his heart pounding against his chest. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small door that led to the back of the House of Mirrors. Luke opened it carefully, revealing the maze of antiquated mirrors. The moonlight entering through the partially broken ceiling created ghostly reflections on the foggy surfaces. It was disorienting, but also offered perfect camouflage. They used to keep important things here, Anna whispered, guiding them through the maze. There's a secret room that even he doesn't know about. Following the girl, they reached a panel that seemed to be just another mirror. Anna pressed a hidden mechanism and the panel slid silently, revealing a small office. Inside, they found old files, photographs, and more surprisingly, a computer covered by a protective cover. It was the park owner's room, Luke explained as they closed the panel behind them. He kept all the secrets here. Richard quickly began examining the documents. Among them, he found something that made his blood run cold. A series of reports on internal investigations involving Gabriel Sanders, the former employee. The accusations went far beyond suspicious behavior. There was a systematic pattern of approaching vulnerable children who frequented the park. "Look at this," called Mia, who had approached a file. "They're old photos of the employees." In the yellowed photographs, Richard immediately recognized the man with the blue van. But his name wasn't Gabriel Sanders. He appeared identified as Carl Mitchell, administrative assistant. The real Gabriel Sanders was someone else. He lied about who he was, Anna murmured, her eyes wide. Why? Before Richard could answer, they heard voices approaching the House of Mirrors. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness outside their hiding place. "The children know this place better than anyone," said the voice of the false Gabriel. "They could be anywhere." Richard took out his cell phone. Here, protected by the thick walls of the secret room, there was a weak signal line. It was his chance. He quickly began taking photos of the documents, his hands trembling slightly as he focused on the most important evidence. "What are you going to do?" asked Luke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to get you out of here," Richard replied, determined. "But first, we need to understand exactly who we're fighting against." As he photographed more documents, he found something that made his heart race. A list of payments. The name of the false Gabriel appeared next to several suspicious deposits, all coming from a company called Secure Future International Adoption Services. The pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a much larger and more disturbing puzzle than Richard could have imagined. These children weren't just victims of a disturbed man. They were pieces in a much larger and more sinister scheme. Richard continued examining the documents found in the secret office, each new discovery more disturbing than the last. Secure Future wasn't just an adoption agency, it was a front for something much bigger. The papers revealed a network of international contacts, all connected by suspicious financial transactions. "There are more children," Anna whispered, pointing to a folder marked with the current year. "In other places like this." The businessman carefully opened the folder. Inside, he found detailed reports of other abandoned amusement parks in different states, all purchased by the same shell company. Each location followed a similar pattern, isolated, away from major centers, perfect for hiding secrets. "How did you discover this room?" Richard asked Anna while continuing to photograph the documents. The girl exchanged a significant look with Luke before answering. "It was Peter who found it. He was very smart, always exploring every corner of the park. On the last night we saw him, he said he had discovered something big, something that could help us get out of here." Outside, the footsteps and voices continued. The men's flashlights created dancing shadows through the cracks of the secret panel. "We need to check the main office too," said the voice of the false Gabriel. "If someone found the old files..." Richard realized that time was running short. He needed to act, but he also needed more information. That's when Mia, who had been rummaging through an old drawer, caught his attention. "Mr. Richard, look at this," she whispered, holding an old USB drive still with the park's original logo. The businessman looked at the covered computer. It was risky. Turning it on could make noise, draw attention, but it could also contain crucial information. Carefully, he removed the protective cover. The computer was old, but had been well preserved. "Anna, Luke, keep watch," he instructed in a low voice. "Mia, help me check if there's any other USB drive or hard drive around here." As he turned on the computer, he kept the volume completely muted. The machine started with a soft hum, almost inaudible. The minutes it took to start up seemed like an eternity. When he finally managed to access the files on the USB drive, his suspicions were confirmed. Detailed spreadsheets of adoptions, astronomical values, names of international buyers. "They're moving to the other side," Luke warned in an urgent, whisper. "But there's someone else coming, I heard a car." Richard continued rapidly copying the files to his cell phone. Among the digital documents, he found something even more disturbing. Photos, dozens of them showing children in different, abandoned parks, all with the same frightened look he had seen in the eyes of Anna and her friends. "Peter discovered all of this," Anna murmured, looking over Richard's shoulder. "That's why they—" Her voice was interrupted by the sound of raised voices coming from outside. Apparently the newcomers were not expected. "What are you doing?" "Here." The voice of the false Gabriel sounded tense. "No one was supposed to be in the park today." "Change of plans," replied an unfamiliar female voice. "The Swiss buyer arrived earlier than expected. She wants to see the merchandise today." Richard felt his stomach turn at the cold, commercial tone used to refer to the children. Anna and Luke exchanged frightened looks. Clearly, this had never happened before. "The children aren't prepared," protested the false Gabriel. "We need time to—" "We don't have time," the woman cut him off. "The deal needs to be closed today. Our contacts in immigration only guarantee clean paperwork until tomorrow." The businessman finished copying the last files and silently turned off the computer. His brain was working at full speed, trying to formulate a plan. They had enough evidence to expose the entire operation, but first they needed to get out of there safely. That's when he noticed something in the files he had just copied, a detailed map of the park, including all the underground passages used by employees. One of them led directly outside the park limits, exiting in a wooded area near the main road. "Children," Richard whispered, showing the map on his cell phone. "I think I found our escape route." The old park map showed an intricate network of maintenance tunnels, built to allow employees to move discreetly during the park's operational days. Richard carefully studied the map on his cell phone, memorizing the safest route to the exit. "The entrance to the main tunnel is behind the carousel," he whispered, pointing to the digital map. "If we can get there without being seen, we can follow it under the park to the exit in the wooded area." Anna frowned, thoughtful. "But the carousel is on the other side of the House of Mirrors. We'll have to pass by them." The sound of footsteps and voices continued outside. The newly arrived woman seemed to be giving instructions about documents and procedures, her cold and professional voice echoing through the empty space. "We need to create a distraction," suggested Luke, his eyes shining with an idea. "Remember how we used to make noise in different places to confuse him when we were hungry?" Richard looked at the boy with admiration. These children had developed impressive survival strategies during their time in captivity. "How did you do that?" Mia smiled for the first time since they had met her, a mischievous smile that lit up her young face. "The House of Mirrors has an old sound system. If we turn it on, the echo confuses. It sounds like the noise is coming from everywhere." "And there's more," added Anna, getting excited about the plan. "The emergency lights still work. If we activate everything at once," Richard began to understand the plan. The controlled chaos could give them the cover they needed to reach the carousel. He checked the map again. The control room was just a few meters from their current hiding place. "Luke, you and Anna know the system best. Can you get to the control room?" The two exchanged confident looks and nodded. Years of exploring every corner of the park had made this place their territory, even if it was their prison. "I'll go with them," Mia offered. "I know all the shortcuts between the mirrors." Richard hesitated for a moment. The idea of separating the group didn't please him, but he knew that the children knew this place better than anyone. "Okay, but be very careful. At the first sign of danger, come back here." As the three prepared to leave, Richard continued studying the documents they had found. Something in the papers caught his attention, a list of codes and passwords, including combinations for various locks, scattered throughout the park. "Wait," he called softly, showing the paper to the children. "This might be useful. Memorize. These codes, you might need them." Anna quickly memorized the number sequences, her eyes showing years of practice in storing important information for survival. Luke and Mia did the same. "When we activate the system, you'll have about 2 minutes before they realize it's a distraction," Luke explained. "You and the other children need to be ready to run to the carousel as soon as you hear the music. Start." Richard nodded, impressed by the maturity and planning demonstrated by these children who had been forced to grow up so quickly. He checked his cell phone one last time, ensuring that all the evidence was securely stored. "We'll meet in the tunnel," Anna whispered, her voice firm despite the visible fear in her eyes. "If something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Richard interrupted, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "I won't leave you behind. I promise." The three moved silently to the secret panel, preparing to leave. That's when they heard something that made everyone freeze, footsteps rapidly approaching the House of Mirrors, accompanied by an authoritative voice. "I want to see all the children now," the woman demanded. "The buyer is arriving in 15 minutes. We need to prepare them for the presentation." Richard realized that their time was running out quickly. The plan needed to work on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. He watched the determined faces of Anna, Luke, and Mia disappear behind the panel, silent as shadows, carrying with them the hope of all. The minutes that followed Anna, Luke, and Mia's departure were the longest in Richard's life. In the hiding place of the secret room, he and the other 4 children waited in absolute silence, each second seeming like an eternity. From outside, they could hear the movement increasing. More people had arrived at the park. "Where are all the children?" The woman's voice sounded increasingly irritated. "You had one task. Keep them together for the presentation." "They must be playing hide and seek," the false Gabriel replied, trying to stay calm. "They know every corner of this place, but they always appear when we call." Richard checked his cell phone again. It had been exactly 7 minutes since the 3 had left. If everything was going according to plan, they should have already reached the control room. He looked at the 4 children by his side. Jack, 8 years old, who hadn't spoken since arriving at the park, the twins Paula and Carla, 9 years old, who communicated mainly through looks, and Tyler, 7 years old, the youngest of the group. "When the music starts," he whispered to them, "you need to be very brave and fast. We're going to run without looking back, okay?" The children nodded in silence, their large eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and hope. Suddenly, a familiar sound cut through the air. The first notes of the park's old theme song began to play, distorted by time and the aged speakers. Simultaneously, all the emergency lights in the House of Mirrors lit up, creating a kaleidoscope of reflections that made it impossible to distinguish the real from the reflected images. Cries of surprise echoed from outside. "What's going on?" The woman's voice sounded alarmed. "Turn this off immediately." "The system is old." An unknown, male voice replied. "It must have short-circuited." It was the moment they had been waiting for. Richard opened the secret panel and guided the children out. In the mirror maze, the flashing lights created perfect visual confusion for their escape. Following the map on his cell phone, he led the group through an alternative path while hearing the adults run in the opposite direction, towards the control room. As they reached the exit of the House of Mirrors, they saw Luke frantically waving from behind a bush. The boy had managed to plant another distraction, several toys deliberately scattered towards the Ferris wheel, as if the children had fled that way. "Anna and Mia are already at the carousel," Luke whispered, joining the group. They found the tunnel entrance. They crossed the open space between the attractions as quickly and silently as possible, taking advantage of the fact that the confusion had drawn everyone to the other side of the park. The carousel, with its dusty horses and broken mirrors, never looked as scary as it did that night. Anna and Mia were waiting for them behind a loose panel at the base of the ride. The tunnel entrance was there, partially hidden by years of accumulated vegetation. The girls had already used the memorized codes to open the padlock that sealed the passage. "Hurry," Anna whispered, helping the younger children enter. "The music won't last much longer." As if responding to her words, the sound began to fail, alternating moments of music with static. The lights also began to blink more slowly. "I found the children!" A shout cut through the night. One of the men had seen them. "Get in now!" Richard ordered, practically pushing the last children into the tunnel. He himself had barely managed to close the panel behind him when he heard heavy footsteps approaching the carousel. The tunnel was narrow and damp, illuminated only by the weak light from Richard and Anna's cell phones. The concrete walls amplified every sound, making it impossible to know if they were being followed. The businessman consulted the map once. They needed to go straight ahead for about 200 meters, then turn right at a fork. "Do they know these tunnels?" he asked Luke as they advanced. "Not all of them," the boy replied. Peter discovered many of them, but he never told the van man everything. He said we needed to have our own secrets. Behind them, the sound of metal creaking echoed through the tunnel. Someone had found the entrance. The race against time was now even more desperate. The group advanced through the dark tunnel, guided only by the light of their cell phones. Richard stayed at the rear, making sure no child was left behind. The footsteps of their pursuers echoed ever closer, reverberating off the damp walls of the tunnel. "There's an old maintenance room just after the next turn," Anna whispered, leading the group. Peter said it was a good hiding place. As they turned the corner, they came face to face with a rusty metal door. Luke quickly typed one of the codes they had memorized into the electronic padlock. To everyone's relief, the old lock still worked, opening with a soft click. The room was larger than they expected, full of old tools and documents. Richard silently closed the door behind them, and everyone held their breath as their pursuers' footsteps approached. "They can't have gone far," the woman's voice echoed down the corridor. "Check all the branches." As they waited in silence, Richard examined the environment with the weak light of his cell phone. The room seemed to have been a kind of secondary control center. On the walls, old maps showed not just the park, but the entire surrounding region. "Look at this," Mia whispered, pointing to a shelf. Among rusty tools and yellowed manuals, there was a metal box with the park's original logo. Carefully, Richard opened the box. Inside, he found an old diary and a series of photographs. The images showed the park in its early days, including the construction of the tunnels. But one photo in particular caught his attention. It showed a group of employees, and among them was a familiar face, much younger, but unmistakable. "It's his father," Anna murmured, pointing to the photo. The van man showed it once. He said, "His father helped build this place. That's why he had the right to use it as he wanted." Richard quickly flipped through the diary, its pages revealing a dark story. The false Gabriel's father had been the chief engineer during the park's construction, responsible for creating the entire network of tunnels. But the last entries suggested that he had discovered something disturbing about the true purposes of some of the secret passages. "Here," Luke pointed out, reading over Richard's shoulder, "he wrote about a tunnel that wasn't in the official plans, something they wanted to keep secret." The sound of footsteps returned, now coming from another direction. The pursuers had separated, covering different routes. "We need to continue," Richard whispered, tucking the diary into his jacket. "But first..." He quickly photographed the most important pages and the map on the wall, which showed details that weren't in his digital version. Tyler, the youngest of the group, pulled on Richard's sleeve. "There's a symbol just like that one in the back," he said, pointing to a specific marking on the map. At the back of the room, partially hidden by old boxes, there was a discreet door with the same symbol. Anna quickly consulted her memory of the codes they had discovered. "It's the same sequence as the main entrance, but backwards," she whispered. Typing the numbers into the electronic panel, the door opened with a soft hum, revealing a passage that wasn't on any of the official maps. The tunnel looked newer than the others, with smooth walls and without the characteristic dampness. "This tunnel should lead us outside the park's perimeter," Richard said, checking his location on his cell phone. "If we follow it..." A noise at the main door of the room interrupted his reasoning. Someone was trying to open the padlock. "They're coming," Paula, one of the twins, whispered, grabbing her sister's hand. Richard quickly guided the children to the secret passage. When the last of them entered, he closed the door behind him, hoping that the pursuers would take a while to discover this path. The new tunnel was different from all the others. Emergency lights still worked, emitting a faint glow every few meters. On the walls, modern markings indicated distances and directions. "This wasn't built for the park," Richard murmured, his mind connecting the clues. It was made later by the organization behind all this. The distant sound of voices echoed behind them. The secret passage had been discovered. But now, with the evidence they had found, Richard was beginning to understand the true dimension of what they had uncovered. This park wasn't just an isolated place of captivity. It was part of a much larger and more organized network. The modern tunnel stretched out before them like a concrete serpent, its emergency lights blinking at regular intervals. Richard and the children advanced as quickly as they could, aware of the sounds of pursuit echoing ever closer. "Wait," Anna whispered, stopping abruptly. "Do you hear that?" A different sound was mixing with the echo of their pursuers' footsteps, a low, constant hum, like that of electrical generators. As they advanced, the sound grew louder. "There!" Luke pointed to a side door. Unlike the others, this one was modern with a digital control panel beside it. Richard examined the panel, but it didn't correspond to any of the codes they had found. That's when Mia approached, her eyes fixed on something above the door. "It's the same symbol as the company," she said, pointing to a discrete mark on the wall, the Secure Future logo. Anna furrowed her brow, concentrating. "Peter once told me he saw numbers on a computer screen. He memorized them because he thought they were important. 251479. Richard typed the sequence into the panel, and the door slid silently open, revealing a room that made everyone freeze in surprise. It was a complete operations center, with monitors, files, and modern equipment. "My God," Richard murmured, observing the screens. Each monitor showed images from different locations, other abandoned parks, all with children in similar situations. "That's why the buyer came in person," Luke said, his voice trembling. "They're expanding the operation." Richard quickly began photographing everything: documents, screens, records. In one of the drawers, he found fake passports and forged adoption documents, all ready to be used. "Look at this," Carla, one of the twins, called, pointing to a digital map on the wall. It was an intricate network of similar locations, all connected, forming a web that spread across several countries. The businessman connected his cell phone to one of the computers, quickly beginning to transfer files. Each new document revealed more details about the operation. Involved politicians, corrupt businessmen, an international trafficking network disguised as an adoption agency. "Richard!" Anna's urgent voice alerted him. "They're coming!" The sounds of footsteps were closer, and now they could hear voices giving orders, systematically organizing the search. "Take these," Richard said, handing small backup drives to each child. "If we get separated, each of you will have a copy of the evidence." As the children stored the devices, Richard noticed something on one of the monitors that made his blood run cold. Security cameras showed more people entering the park, some carrying heavy equipment. "They're planning to clean everything up," Luke murmured, who was also observing the screens. "Like they did when Peter—" "We won't let that happen," Richard interrupted firmly. He consulted the digital map one last time, memorizing the nearest escape route. On the main screen, a newly arrived email was blinking. Richard opened it quickly. It was a message confirming the arrival of more international buyers in the coming days. The operation was much larger than they had imagined. "There," Mia pointed to another door at the back of the room. "There's an emergency exit." Indeed, a fire escape led directly to the surface. According to the map, it would emerge near the main road, far from the original park boundaries. The sound of voices grew louder. Their pursuers had found the entrance to the operations center. There was no more time. "Let's go," Richard whispered, guiding the children to the emergency staircase. "Quietly, like you taught me." As they climbed the metal steps, they could hear the main door of the operations center being opened. The woman's voice sounded furious. "They saw everything. Activate the emergency protocol immediately." Alarms began to sound throughout the tunnel system. Red lights replaced the normal lighting. and a metallic sound indicated that security doors were being automatically closed. "We're almost there," Richard encouraged, seeing a faint natural light filtering through a grate above them. "Just a few more meters." The grate at the top of the stairs was their last barrier to freedom. But when Richard tried to push it, he discovered it was locked. And this time, none of the codes they knew seemed to work. The locked grate seemed to be the last insurmountable obstacle in their escape. The alarms continued to sound, and the sounds of pursuit were getting closer and closer. Richard frantically examined the locking mechanism, looking for any clue that might help them. "Wait," Anna whispered, her eyes shining with a sudden realization. "Peter always said the answer is at the beginning." Luke understood immediately. "The first code, the one for the park entrance." Richard quickly typed the original sequence into the panel next to the grate. Nothing happened. The children looked at each other, despair beginning to show on their faces. That's when Mia, the smallest of them, stepped forward. "No, it's the code from the first day, the day it all began." The girl approached the panel and typed in a date, 06 to 1513, the day of the first children's disappearance according to the report Richard had found. The grate unlocked with a soft click. "How did you know?" Richard asked, impressed. "It's written on all the old photos," Mia replied. "The van man always looked at them with pride." There was no time for more questions. Richard pushed the grate and helped each child climb up. They emerged in a wooded area, the fresh night air a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the tunnels. They were about 500 meters from the main road, protected by dense vegetation. Richard checked his cell phone. All the evidence was still there, including the files copied from the operations center. "Look," Tyler pointed excitedly. Police car lights could be seen at the park's main entrance. The email Richard had quickly sent from the operations center, along with some crucial evidence to his contact in the federal police, had worked. "Attention!" An amplified voice echoed across the property. "The park is surrounded. All suspects must surrender peacefully." Anna grabbed Richard's hand, silent tears running down her face. "Is it really over?" "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, hugging the girl. "It's over." The next few hours were a whirlwind of events. The police found not only evidence of the trafficking network, but also connections to similar cases in other countries. The false Gabriel, the woman, and their accomplices were arrested still inside the tunnels, trying to destroy evidence. Peter's true identity also came to light. He hadn't disappeared. He was protected in a special witness program after managing to contact the authorities. His information had been crucial to initiating the investigation, but the lack of concrete evidence had prevented more direct actions until then. 3 months later, Richard was watching the sunset from his office when he received a special call. Anna, Luke, and the other children had been officially taken in by properly vetted families. Some had even been reunited with relatives who had been looking for them for years. The businessman smiled as he heard the excited voices of the children on the other end of the line, telling him about their new lives, schools, and friends. Joyland Park, now permanently closed, served only as evidence in judicial proceedings. "Mr. Richard," Anna's voice sounded different, lighter, more appropriate for her age. "Can we meet next weekend, all of us?" "Of course," he replied, looking at the project on his desk. Plans for a new community center that would be built with resources from the sale of his other ventures. "I have a surprise to show you." The center, which would be built on the site of the old St. Clair's orphanage, would include not only spaces for children and adolescents, but also a specialized department for locating and reuniting separated families. As he hung up the phone, Richard looked at the framed photo on his wall, him and the 8 children smiling on the day they left the temporary shelter. Joyland Park had been purchased as a commercial investment, but it ended up providing something much more valuable: the chance to transform lives and bring justice. On the desk, among documents for the new project, was a small teddy bear, the same one he had found on his first visit to the park. Anna had insisted that he keep it, as a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures can be found in the most unlikely places, and that true joy comes from being able to make a difference in someone's life.